Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video on History Vibe Podcast. And today I'm joined by Celene Lillie. For those that do not know, Celene Lillie is a scholar of New Testament and the early Jesus movement who holds a PhD and Master's of Divinity from the Union Theological Seminary in New York City and a Bachelor's of Arts in Contemplative Psychology from Naropa University. She considers herself multivocational, adjuncting and advising at several undergraduate and graduate institutions, lecturing and preaching nationally, and served as the Director of Adult Education and Spiritual Formation at First United Methodist Church in Boulder. Dr. Lillie works at the intersections of ancient language and context and contemporary questions of gender, trauma, justice, and community to ask meaningful questions of early Christian texts. What can the life and death of Jesus tell us about how to live our lives? What does it mean to be vulnerable in a violent world? How do we act? What does it mean to be in a community? How can we live lives in the service of all that brings life rather than that which deals death? Among several articles and co-authored books, she has authored The Rape of Eve, The Transformation of Roman Ideology in Free Early Christian Retellings of Genesis, which engages responses of the early Jesus movement to Roman conquest and sexual violence, which this interview is based upon. To get her book, please check the description box below for the History Valley Amazon affiliate link and the pinned comment as well. And that being said, welcome to History Valley Podcast, Dr. Celene Lillie.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. So can you tell us about the free rape, the free rape of Eve narratives? What is each one called, and what do they tell us about this rape story?
So this story shows up in three different texts, and the first is the Secret Revelation of John, sometimes called the Apocryphon of John. Second is on the origin of the world, and the third is the reality of the rulers, sometimes called the hypostasis of the archons. And these are all three are retellings of the Genesis narrative, and our best guess is that probably not these final texts, but at least kind of the core of this story was written sometime in the mid-2nd century. And our guess why is because Irenaeus is writing about, or at least writing about something close to these stories in 180 CE. So they have to be at least partially around by that point. And this story that happens in the middle, it's very interesting. Many scholars have kind of framed this narrative much in the same way that they have framed the Genesis narrative, where, Eve is the one who brings kind of original or sexual sin into the world. And it seems that something very different is going on in these three texts, where rather than being the bringer of sin or the transgressor, Eve is really the savior of the world. And in these texts, these lower gods, and I'm sure we'll get into this as well, but there are kind of several sets of gods in these texts, and there's kind of the true God of the upper realm, and then there are these lower gods who are the gods of the material world, and they get jealous of Eve's power. And so one of the ways in which they are trying to kind of garner her power is by sexually violating her. And so that kind of ends up being at least the part that I think is most interesting, or one of the most interesting parts of these stories, where it really flips Genesis on its head in these moments and kind of revalues much of what we have from the Genesis narrative in the Bible.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see that, because in the book of Genesis, Eve is created out of the rib of Adam. There appears to be no rape going on, and Adam has consensual intercourse with Eve, and they have Cain and Abel, and eventually Seth. But in these different narratives, and I would like you to talk about this as well, one of them says that Eve mothered Cain by the rulers, and Abel by Adam. So why do you think that Cain was made the offspring of the rulers rather than Adam as the father?
So, I mean, we all of these things we can't know for sure, but my hunch around this is that So often, again, we tend to place sin in the garden in the Adam and Eve story. But the first time that sin is actually mentioned is when Cain kills Abel. And my hunch is it's because of that fratricide, this violence, and that in these texts, the rulers really are the epitome of the type of violence that then and now, in many ways, we see kind of being uh, perpetrated um, in the world. And so my hunch is that it made sense for these folks in the ancient world that Cain, really being the one who brings sin into the world for the first time through murder, comes through the rulers rather than through Adam, who is always framed as the partner of Eve in these texts. I mean, they call them partner is the primary word that's used in the Coptic to talk about their relationship.
And so, what do you think originated the idea that Eve was raped? Where did that come from?
So I think, it's such a different story than we get in the Hebrew scriptures. And one of the things that we notice kind of all kinds of folks doing at this time is using these ancient narratives to make meaning in their contemporary worlds. And so one of the things that I think that folks who wrote and told these stories were working with were these rape narratives that were part of Roman imperial ideology and propaganda in many ways. That Rome, one of the primary ways in which Roman conquest was figured, both in written texts and in visual texts, is through rape. And just to say, one of the people who I've really followed on this is Davina Lopez, and and I think these texts are really a critique of those founding narratives, which rely so heavily on sexual violence, um, to justify the actions of Rome, whether it be kind of in Rome's primordial beginnings with Romulus, with Rhea Silvia and Mars, to start out with Rhea Silvia and Mars being the parents of Romulus and Remus. Um, Romulus ending up being the founder of Rome, and then again, and then stealing women from his neighbors in order to get wives and women for the Romans. And so these narratives of sexual violence are kind of baked into Rome's history, and this becomes a way to talk about conquest, particularly during the Augustan era, and then after as well. And so I don't think these texts. One of the things that I've had that sometimes students ask, is this really what happened to Eve? And I'm like, no, this is not really what happened to Eve, if we even want to think about Eve as somebody who existed, but that folks saw this story as a resource to push up against these violent Roman narratives that were so ubiquitous in during that time period.
I would like to ask you about the intertextuality. You mentioned in the book that you favor or lean towards Daniel Boyarin's view on the intertextuality between these free narratives. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So one of the things that is interesting about intertextuality is that we really want to kind of think about it as the maybe I'll call it the milieu and mess that people find themselves in, and that we are all already kind of living in the midst of intertextualities. We internalize all of these things that are happening in our world. And when, even talking now, this is the product of the way in which the nexus of all kinds of things that I've learned and experienced are coming kind of through my mouth right now. And this is really, I think one of the things that I think is so interesting about Boyarin is that it's not just about one thing necessarily influencing another per se, but this matrix in which things have influence that goes both ways. And again, so this is one of the reasons why I think it's so important to maybe I'll rewind for just a second. One of the things about Nag Hammadi is that, and so many of these ancient texts that have been discovered kind of in the more recent past, in the last 150 years, is that, as a biblical scholar, we always joke about the fact that, the Bible didn't just drop from the sky. People wrote this, it changes over time, all of these things. But because Nag Hammadi kind of was fully baked and then, all of a sudden appears, uh, 1500 years later, there's a way in which I think we have treated it as something that's fallen from the sky. And so there's been, because there hasn't been a 2,000 year history of interpretation to go along with it. And so we're kind of groping a little bit, trying to figure out, what's happening, what's happening in the text. And again, what might the social milieu be? And this has been a question that people, I don't think until, really it's been, I think, the last 20 or 30 years that people have started asking this question, maybe these texts aren't just hyper spiritualized, but there might be something in them that's pointing to the social milieu at large. And I think that's one of the most important things to me in coming back to these texts again and again and again is asking these questions in better, new, and different ways about what are, we're never going to be able to pin it down, but what might some of the possibilities be from which these texts emerged beyond a spiritualized, monastic, world-hating community, which I don't actually think the texts reflect.
Can you expand more on Rhea Silvia? And can you tell us a bit about her rape at the hands of Mars and how that is connected to the rape of Eve?
Yeah, so one of the things, so kind of Rome has these big founding moments, four big founding moments, and all of them are these narratives of sexual violence. And the first one that we find is with Rhea Silvia, and Rhea Silvia is comes from the line of Aeneas, and this becomes important for Augustus as he founds the Roman Empire because he wants to trace his lineage back to gods. And so we get kind of Aeneas on the side of Rhea Silvia, and her father was king during the time, and her brother and her uncle really wanted to usurp this power. And so he ends up killing her father and then killing all of her brothers and then making Rhea Silvia a Vestal Virgin under the guise of honoring her. But it's really because the time of service of a Vestal Virgin is basically her entire childbearing years. So he can guarantee that this last heir of the king will not be able to have children. And she is out gathering water for a ritual, and the stories, and I love this too about ancient history. The stories that we get about this say all kinds of things. That maybe it was Mars, maybe it was her uncle himself, maybe it was some other kind of suitor, but that in the end, this gets attributed to Mars, and she's raped by him, and she gets pregnant and has twins, and in some of the stories, she's put in prison and eventually released. In others, she dies. So we get kind of all of this, again, conflicting stories, but not a really horrible consequences for Rhea Silvia, because she has lost her virginity and what this kind of means. What this generally means for Rome. And the two children are placed in a basket and put in the Tiber River. And eventually, the story goes that Lupa, so a she-wolf, or this is also the word for prostitute in Latin, picks them up and takes care of them until they're grown, and then they end up finding the city. And interestingly, too, like Cain and Abel, Romulus kills his brother Remus. So we also have a fratricide in the middle of this in the middle of this story as well. But because of this moment, and the texts also say, Romulus is a lot like his father Mars, very violent, and warlike. So we do get this in the text too. But this then, this moment of sexual violence, which is a real taboo because because Rhea Silvia is a Vestal Virgin, becomes this moment that makes the founding of Rome possible.
I find it interesting that point you just made there, that the idea that Romulus is reminiscent of his father Mars. Did the authors of these free narratives that we're talking about here, did they, especially when the idea about making Cain the son of Yaldabaoth, and Yaldabaoth is viewed as evil. He's Jesus is not his son. It disputes the idea that Jesus is his son is not his son, because it's the Gnostics. They think that Jesus is the son of a different, better deity. So is it conflating details of Romulus and Remus with the Jewish narrative of Cain and Abel? Do you think that's what's potentially going on here?
So I do think that that's some of what's going on. And one of the things that I would just note about this, and it's something that I'm still um, I'm still in the process of kind of unpacking as I go back to these texts again and again and again. But asking this question about, is Yaldabaoth really supposed to be um, equivalent to the Jewish God, or is something else actually happening? And one of the things that has been noticed by lots of folks around this is, we get these two narratives in these two creation narratives in Genesis. That one of them goes through 1 and 2, and then the other one is primarily in chapter 3, where we get Adam and Eve. And in the first story, you know, God creates human beings, male and female. They're created, and so there seems to be this kind of androgyny within the human being, which we sometimes see reflected in these texts when it talks about the children kind of from the true God. And in the Greek translation of this, the word that's used to translate the God Elohim in from the first narrative is theos, so the word for God. When we move to the second creation narrative, where we get the Adam and Eve story, this is the word for Yud He Vav He, gets translated as Kurios, or the word that gets translated as Lord or Master. It's also the word that would have been used for the emperor. And so here is where I think these folks are, and it's one of the reasons why, again, I look at Daniel Boyarin's intertextuality, because one of the things that he's looking at and asking questions about is, what are the rabbis doing with Midrash? And I think this is a really important question to ask. Do they really think this God is an evil God, or are they making different kinds of meaning and really noticing the ways in which, or playing with the fact that the God in this second creation narrative uses the same honorific as the emperor, and using this as a way to really critique what's happening with the empire and the emperor as well. And so then, if we go back to the story of Romulus, for example, he really becomes the paradigmatic first emperor who has the first military victories, the first Roman marriages, the first Roman triumph. And this becomes the template for everything that comes after. And so by putting him in this place and making these connections, I do think there's something there in this that would have been, I think it would have been hard for people hearing this to not kind of make that obvious connection between them. And again, just to say, one of the people who really was the first to start thinking about this in terms of the secret revelation of John was Karen King, and noticing the ways in which the rulers are really framed. And this word archon is the word for rulers, and that there is this way in which these heavenly beings are reflected in the pantheon, and then in what's going on with the emperors and their uh, deification in the real world, quote unquote, as well.
Do you think that this could be linked to, harkening back to Cain being made into the son of Yaldabaoth? Um, do you think there could be a link with John 8:44 when it says that um, that the Jews are the sons of the devil, and it says that the devil, your father is a murderer, was a murderer from the beginning. Could it be interpreting? Could this be based on an interpretation of John 8, potentially as an identification of Cain with the devil in some way, as being plugged in into the parallels with Romulus and Remus and other narratives that led into the creation of the idea that Cain is the son of Yaldabaoth?
I think it's a really interesting question, and one of the places that I'm, I think, trying to be careful at the nexus of my own work is noticing the ways in which, like, something like John 8 has really been has been used in the service of anti-Judaism, and asking a different set of questions about what might the complexities be going on with folks who are clearly using a narrative from the Hebrew scriptures um, to make meaning. And and I mean, I it's something that definitely merits some thought. And as I'm kind of, spinning through this at the moment, one of the questions that I would ask too is, um I'm not totally sure how I want to phrase this. I'm wondering also if this can complexify that story in John, kind of looking at it in
Yeah.
juxtaposition with a question like, is who is Cain? What's going on there? And I just want to notice too that we do get Abel, we get Seth, we get these other figures that are clearly in this primordial Israelite realm, whatever we want to call this this pre-primordial, um, before the Israelites, before the Hebrews realm, and that some of the children are savior figures and others are not, based on that parentage, and um, and all of that is coming through Eve. So I think it's really interesting, and I feel like I want to think about this a lot more.
Yeah, this might be slightly off topic, but it just made me think about something else going on, because by the third century, you get Christians like Origen responding against individuals like Celsus,
Yeah,
and Celsus is making this allegation that Mary was raped by a Roman soldier.
yeah,
And I just find that interesting that, okay, so you have the rape of Mary going on one hand, and then earlier than that, you've got stories of Eve's rape on the other. And I just find that interesting that it looks like that there's an attempt of bringing in these Greco-Roman stories into Christian context, anti-Christian context as well. And it seems to be a commonality going around, in these circulating among these various groups.
yeah. So I really appreciate the juxtaposition um between those two stories. And I one of the things that I think the Eve story in particular is doing is calling attention to this type of sexual violence. And we it could be an open question about, do the folks who are writing this story know about this other story about Mary? Is
Yeah.
is it possible that this is in the milieu as well? But one of the things that we do also notice is and this is one of the reasons why I think I keep coming back to these texts, because the rhetoric then and the rhetoric now seems to be so very similar, but of victim blaming the woman. We get this in Tertullian. Tertullian has many things that, in my opinion, slander women in all kinds of ways. But one of the things that he says is he references another story from kind of these founding Roman narratives when Rome moves from the monarchy to moves from the monarchy, and this is the rape of Lucretia, and she basically at the end of the story um, uh, dies by suicide because she says, I don't want anyone um, who this happens to use me as an excuse that everything's fine. And Tertullian lifts her up as a good model for Christian women. And so this kind of message of um, better to be dead than violated. And the thing that I find so interesting about these Eve stories is that they fly in the face of that and say, no, we're going to put blame actually with the perpetrator rather than the victim, which happens in a lot of these stories. And that there's really no shame attached to Eve at all with this, that the shame, the blame, the guilt, the violence is all placed with the rulers, which, even in today's world is not the thing that happens a lot of the time with victims of sexual violence. And so they're really, so I wonder, too, to even think about this with this legend about Mary, is this another way of saying, it doesn't really matter? I mean, of course it matters. The violence happens. The violence matters, but this does not actually do anything to Mary's character. This is not actually a slander of her, if this happened, and which is how, if reading it through the Eve story, it would be the interpretation that one would come to.
So, who do you think Yaldabaoth is supposed to be, and who are these archons exactly?
So I really think that he's supposed to be kind of the stand-in for the imperial powers. And one of the things that I'd note about this is that, so in a book like First Enoch, where we have, so this is the stories of the Watchers, the angels, again, retelling parts of Genesis and the sons of God coming to the daughters of human beings, and teaching them all kinds of things like metallurgy and makeup and war making, and all of the things. But we get these notions that come out of this of as above so below, or as below so above, where we have these corresponding angels in the heavens that that course angels in the heavens that correspond to the nations on the earth. And interestingly, in later rabbinic texts, who is the angel of Rome but Samael, this other name for Yaldabaoth? And I think I think there is this way in which the cosmic drama is a reflection of what happens on earth, and that this really is pointing to, through things like, okay, this is the god that's named Kurios, this is the god that's named Samael, this is the god that can't actually see what's going on. All of these epithets that they give to this god really points to the way in which Yaldabaoth is framed in really similar ways, both to um, the polytheistic gods and to the rulers or emperors on earth who claim divinity in one way, shape, or form.
And how do these various texts change how we understand Eve?
So I think one of the things that they um, do is kind of provide a corrective for some of the later interpretations that we get of this story. And, interestingly, when you go back to the Hebrew, um, when Adam is told, for example, when Adam is told not to eat from the tree, Eve hasn't actually been created yet. And so there's this gap. So how does Eve even know this? Who told her this? She wasn't around. And so here's one of these many places where we need to think about, okay, so what's Adam doing here? What's his responsibility in the story? What's going on? Um, it seems so when the serpent is speaking, many times there are plural yous that are there. And this is, I think, one of the detriments about the English language is that our singular and plural you is the same. And so we assume the serpent says you and that the serpent is talking only to Eve. When the serpent is saying y'all, which means Adam's also there. And Adam is not saying anything. Adam is not doing anything. Adam seems to be kind of abdicating his agency to Eve in this moment. And so there's a whole bunch of other questions that we can ask of the text when we go back to it in the original. So, as we move through the centuries, and particularly going through these first centuries of the Jesus movement moving towards Christianity, we have things like First Timothy, where women are told that they should be silent, they should be submissive to their husbands, they should not teach, etc. And this is because of their relationship with Eve. We have Tertullian, again, at the second century, saying, don't you all know that you're an Eve? You're the one who opened the devil's doorway, much like Pandora opens the box, and basically says, you're the one who it basic. How does he put it? I think Adam was too strong for the devil to tempt, so this is why the devil tempted Eve instead, and because of the sin that she brings into the world, this is why Jesus actually had to die, because of this moment in creation. And so these other stories say something very, very, very different about this. Particularly, I'm thinking of something like On the Origin of the World here, where in On the Origin of the World, Eve is actually an androgynous figure created by these other female figures in the heavenly realm. And they've created, the rulers have created Adam, or the archons have created Adam in order to try and capture one of these divine women. And they give it a soul, but they can't make it stand up, and they don't really want to make him powerful. And Eve is sent basically as a savior to him. And she's the one who says, arise, and he stands up. And the text says, I just happened to be teaching this in a class this week. Her word became a work. And this is then when the rulers get jealous of her, and they actually say, they want to violate her so that her children will be subordinate to them. And they also say that they put a sleep on Adam and tell him this story that Eve came from his ribs so that women would think that they were subordinate to men. And so these ways in which gendered hierarchy has been mapped and naturalized by these interpretations through the Genesis narrative. This story basically cuts through and says, nope, this is not, this was not the divine plan. This is not the way that God wanted it to be. And so then we need to think about, what else we might want for our lives in the midst of this.
Is the secret revelation of John trying to elaborate on the idea of Cain being the son of Yaldabaoth by making Abel the son of Yaldabaoth as well?
So, one of the things that I think that it's trying to do is to really separate out who Seth is in the middle of this. So that then, these other children aren't the ones who are that important, and it's really Seth that's the one that's important. And I should actually know this quote from memory at this point, and I don't. But when Seth is born, um, Eve in the Hebrew Bible actually says, um, like I've something like I've birthed another um, human to replace Abel, basically, but through God. And so there's this way in which um, the text leaves open this possibility for interpretation that Seth has a different parentage. And so I think that these texts are kind of, again, you know, just like the rabbis with Midrash, they're imagining into the gaps of the text.
Can you tell us who Noria is?
So Norea is one of these kind of amazing figures in these texts, and she primarily comes up in the reality of the rulers, the hypostasis of the archons. And so here, rather than Seth kind of being this primary progeny of Eve, it's her daughter, um, Norea. And I always find this scene so kind of so amazingly funny, where she they're kind of retelling the narrative of Noah at this point, and she's trying to get on the ark and they won't let her. And so the text says that she actually blows it up with her fiery breath. And this is, I always wonder, like, what would what would the Noah movie had looked like, if 15 minutes in, Norea just shows up and kind of blows up the ark, and no more movie. But of course, the rulers notice that she does this, and they want to get her power. And so they basically say, we want you, we want to enslave you, like we enslaved your mother. And she's like, nope, that wasn't my real mother. And she cries out for help, and the angel Alelith comes to her rescue, and then it teaches her about the rulers and who they are and how they come to be. And so in this narrative, she is really, first Eve is kind of the first savior figure that intersects with humanity, and then her daughter Norea is really the one who is the savior of humanity in this text in many ways.
I've got to ask. So when she blows up the ark, is it like a alternate version of the story where the Noah riding out the flood in the ark just doesn't happen? Does the ark get rebuilt? Like what happens there?
I think that's such a great question, um, and and my hunch is that, I mean, I can just imagine the people who are writing this, and who knows if this is true or not, but thinking, we all know Noah must have made it because we're here today. And so, so this is one of the places where I think so often um we get very serious when we're interpreting these texts. And I think these folks probably had a lot of humor. And what does it look like? And again, is this the way to interpret? Who knows? But I think again, we need to explore the possibility that that these folks are having a whole heck of a lot of fun imagining, Eve's daughter having some, I always picture her kind of like a dragon, and all of a sudden this breath comes out and poof goes the ark. And that, so for them, they're like, yeah, we don't need to really worry about we don't really need to worry about the Noah part. People already know that story. So we're going to tell this other story to exist alongside it. And, just to say too, this is one of the places where, I also notice whether it is Plutarch or Dionysius of Halicarnassus, but when they're retelling these Roman narratives, they will juxtapose sometimes 3, 4 different stories that contradict one another right next to each other. And there's no problem with this. This is how people do history. And there's no problem with these multiple narratives that don't necessarily agree existing simultaneously side by side one another. And so this is one of the ways that I would want to think about these texts too, that they're not a definitive. And I think this is where we get into trouble sometimes. And I watch myself around this too, these ideas of Gnosticism and having like a Gnosticism and then an Orthodox Christianity. And this idea that then, if the Orthodox Christians believe this one thing, then that the Gnostics have to believe this one other thing. And it just doesn't seem like that's what's happening with these texts, that it's not talking about, no, that thing is wrong and this thing is right, but that here is, a way to play with and tell the story that can exist alongside all of these other stories to make different kinds of meaning and address issues in in our contemporary world.
What do the three narratives share in common, and how do they diverge from one another?
Um, oh goodness. So there's lots of things that they have in common and lots of ways that they diverge from one another. Um, I would say there are all kinds of little details. Like, for example, in the secret revelation of John, Eve really does still come out of Adam's side. And so that text is more careful, follows a little more closely the Genesis narrative than on the origin of the world. Norea we only have the story about her in Hypostasis of the Archons, Reality of the Rulers. So there are all of these kind of little details that are different. But I would say that in all of them, Eve is really vindicated. Adam is kind of she's really the one in a lot of ways that, although this is again a little bit different in Secret Revelation of John, but in both Reality of the Rulers and on the Origin of the World, Eve is really the one who brings life to Adam in a lot of ways. So she is kind of the primary savior figure in those two texts too. Although there are different scholars who ask questions about, is it the tree of knowledge or is it the tree of life that Eve actually goes into? I think it's the tree of knowledge for a whole bunch of reasons. But in those two as well, she eats of the fruit, and Adam also eats of the fruit, and there's this integration of knowledge that happens. One of the interesting things that happens in Secret Revelation of John, for example, that doesn't happen in the other two, that during the place where Yaldabaoth rapes Eve, it actually says that this is the first marriage, which is really interesting and is something that I think there's all kinds of unpacking that can still be done around this, but there's one place where it definitely, to me, has a very strong resonance with the rape of the Sabine women from the Roman founding narratives, where, you know, that's the first Roman marriage, is these this wholesale uh, seizing and violation of the neighboring women by the Romans. So, you know, so there's all of these little there's all kinds of little things like that that vary from text to text. And one of the things that I think, as a historian, that it helps to do is, again, think about the ways in which these stories, or the nuggets of them, were resources, and then they get recast and changed in these sometimes large and sometimes smaller ways, to my hunches, make really particular meaning for whether it's a community or a person who's doing this, but to really make particular meaning for those involved in and connected to the text.
And in my closing question, so in conclusion, why do you think these three narratives of the rape of Eve were composed, and how do they relate to their Greco-Roman counterparts?
So, I mean, I really do think that they are a critique of um, this way in which rape and sexual violence become are not only something that happens kind of in everyday life, but are really the model for Roman conquest, and that these texts are really saying the way that the rulers are structuring and ordering the world is not the way that that God wants, the, you know, this higher God, this God of the heavens, wants the world to be ordered, and that the main piece of it is this huge critique of violence. And I think the violence that comes with civilization, I mean, it's one of the things that happens in all three of the texts as well, that they notice the ways in which human beings are led astray through the trappings of empire, whether it is thinking about imperial religion, or thinking about you know, again, metallurgy, the making of weapons, and what and the ways in which this reflects the evil that human beings do to one another, and how then this is reflected in the structure of the world. And, you know, I do think many of them also end in much the same way as something like the Revelation in the Christian scriptures, where they can't really imagine a world without this, beyond thinking about the destruction of the world that we're in. And I do at times wonder if that's a failure of imagination, but they're trying to imagine something different, or at least imagine a reality where violence, or threat of violence, or coercion through threat of violence is not the norm, and particularly around hierarchy and sexual and gender.
So I'd like to remind the audience to don't forget to get her book. The link will be in the description below and also in the pinned comment. And thank you for joining me today, Professor Celene Lillie.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed being here.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.